Well, hello and welcome back. Again, my name is Andy Bannister. I'm the director of the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity, that evangelism training organisation based in the UK. From we go out to the four walls of the churches, taking the gospel into everywhere from cafes to workplaces to universities, as well as teaching and training and equipping Christians how to share their faith with their friends. If you want to find out more about us, do visit the SOLAS website. On the slides, you can see at the bottom there on that slide shown next to my picture, my video, you'll see the link. And in particular, do encourage you to go to solas-cpc.org/go for Go Conference, and you can download the slides from this talk and my other talks, as well as other useful resources, recommended books, videos, all kinds of things that hopefully will add value to the sessions that I'm giving. Well, in this second talk, in the first talk I gave you, I hopefully gave you some resources and some tools to help you talk about your faith in Christ at work, at home, at school, in a way that engages people, whether you're talking to Muslim friends or secular friends, and also helps you have conversations that go somewhere rather than arguments. And I hope that was helpful. And in the third session, coming up later, I will be talking about looking at the figure of Jesus, what's unique about him, but particularly contrasting, I guess, the Jesus of Christianity with the Jesus of Islam. Jesus turns up in the pages of the Quran, and what do we do with that? Is that a bridge we can use to build to our Muslim friends? What are the differences? What's unique about Jesus in the Bible? And so on. We're going to cover all of that. But in this middle talk of the three that I'm giving at the Go Conference, I want to think about how we can share hope, how we share our hope in Christ in a, I guess, culture of confusion, is the way I've described it. And I'd like us to begin by just refreshing our memory about a verse of Scripture that's kind of lies behind the heart of actually what a lot of what we do at SOLAS, that lies behind what I do as an evangelist. And it's this famous verse in 1 Peter 3, verse 15, where the Apostle Peter writes these words. He says, "But in your hearts, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." You know, what I find interesting about what Peter said there's so many things packed into this verse. The importance of giving a reason why we believe what we believe. You know, the world is full of people who have, compelling personal stories. Peter doesn't say, share your story and tell a little bit about your own journey to Christ or all of those things. And personal testimony is not unimportant. But Peter doesn't say those things. He says rather, give a reason. Give a reason for the hope that you have. In other words, in a world full of competing answers, we need to give reasons why the Christian faith is true. But the thing that intrigues me even more than that is Peter doesn't say be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for your theology, or the reasons why you believe, the doctrinal statements that you do, or even to give a reason for the Christian faith. All of those things are not unimportant. But look what Peter says. Be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have. And that's what I want to think about in this talk. We live in a culture in which I think hope is in short supply. I think that's always been the case, actually, but I think the COVID pandemic has especially made this clear that, for years, many of our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues, have been living on the assumption that, life is easy. I've got my job, I've got my regular income, I've got my hobbies and my friends and my social life and my holidays and everything, and life is comfortable and easy. And then along comes something like the pandemic. And for many people, it was the first time that a lot of those foundations, those pillars they kind of built their life on, have been swept away. And I've met many people, I think, who are asking, well, where is hope to be found? If it's not to be found in my job or my health or society looking fairly stable, where is hope to be found? And so as Christians, I think we really need to be thinking about how do we talk about the hope that we have, why it matters, why we believe it, and the reasons for it. So I want to think about, over the next 35 minutes or so, how we share hope in a culture of confusion. And you see, the culture in which we want to share our hope in Christ is not a neutral space. The public square, our workplaces, the world of the media and social media, our universities and schools, they're not neutral. Our culture is not neutral, just sitting there like a blank canvas waiting for us to, paint the Christian faith for people. Rather, we live in this very confused culture, and that is going to affect how we think about evangelism, how we think about sharing our faith and our hope. What is our culture confused about? Well, there's many things we could say. I think we live in a culture confused about God. It was a few generations ago, it would have been the case that people either believed in the Christian faith, in America, or they didn't. So you either had sort of, Christianity, or maybe nominal Christianity, or nothing. Now, of course, we have 1,001 different worldviews and belief systems. In many major American towns and cities, as it is here in Europe, every belief system possible is represented. People no longer have to choose God or not God, Christianity or atheism. Now people can choose from Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, Judaism, Islam. We're focusing a little bit on Islam today and throughout this conference, and weaving that through some of the talks. And of course, there are millions of Muslims in North America, and no wonder our culture is confused. There are people who believe vastly different things to what we believe, and then of course our secular friends look at this vast array of beliefs and go, well, what do we do with this? And I meet many Westerners who just tell me, I guess you just pick the path that works for you, as long as you don't harm anybody, believe whatever you want to believe. And so I think there's a lot of confusion. And then, of course, at the same time, you also have, I suppose, this sort of low-grade sort of spirituality idea that's crept in everywhere. I meet people who will say to me things like, well, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. And so another layer of confusion. So our culture is very confused about God and faith. Our culture is also confused about what it means to be human. You'll hear loud voices in the public square telling us that human beings are just atoms and particles in motion. Very famous American atheist Lawrence Krauss, astrophysicist and an atheist, recently in an interview said human beings are a 1% bit of pollution in the universe. And while many of our secular friends may not go that far, they probably have this, this idea that we are nothing more than the product of time plus chance plus the forces of evolution. Yet at the same time, as many in our culture believing we are just the molecules of which we are made, we also want to believe in human rights and dignity and so on and so forth. How do those two things hold together? And so our culture, I think, is very confused about God. It's very confused about humanity. And then actually it's confused about a whole array of other things. I'd say our culture is confused about sexuality. It's confused about gender. Look at the whole transgender debate. If you told people 5 or 6 years ago that, one of the big debates going on in 21st century Western culture would be what actually is a woman, or, can a man be pregnant, people would look at you like you were stark, staring mad. But we're now in a culture where people are deeply confused about gender. We're confused about purpose. Is there a purpose to life, or are we just here to have as much fun before we die? Significance. I think that's a huge question I meet, particularly from students. Do I matter? Does my life matter? How does my life matter? Why does my life matter? Identity. We live in an age that wants to divide us up and say, find your identity in your tribe. And that's where your identity lies, whether it's your political tribe or, whatever it is. And then, obviously don't associate with others. We live in this very divided world. And then truth. It used to be the case that people thought you could spell truth with a capital T. There's a definite truth out there to discover. And now, of course, all that's changed as well. So we live in a very confused age. So throughout this talk, I'm actually going to just make things a little bit more interactive. So what I'd like you to do, just for a minute or so, is if you are watching live at the conference, turn to the person next to you. If you're watching at home on a video screen, perhaps you're watching this streamed, maybe watching it with somebody else, turn to the person next to you. Or if you are on your own, you can still sit there and think about this question. Now, for the next minute, maybe 2 minutes, I'm going to give you, think about this question, discuss it with the person next to you if there is another person in the room or next to you. What are some of the other ways that our culture might be said to be a culture of confusion? Have a think about that one, and then I'll see you in 2 minutes' time. Well, welcome back. I hope if you had a chance to discuss that question, some of the ways that our culture might be confused with those around you, it was helpful. Or if it just you sat there and thought about it, maybe again, hopefully that gave you a bit of space to process that. Well, all that to say, because we live in this very confused culture, this is not an easy culture to do evangelism in or to share our faith in. You know, it's worth recognising it can be tough. It can be tough to be trying to share our faith at work, at home, in our neighbourhoods and whatever. You know, it's a challenge in this very confused culture. How do we share hope, like 1 Peter 3:15 compels us to do? How do we share hope in a culture of confusion? Well, I want to explore that idea for a short while today by looking at a famous passage in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul takes on the very confused culture of his day. We're going to look together at Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. Let me read these verses to you, and then I'm going to draw out some lessons. I think 5 lessons, actually, we can draw out from what Paul does here to how we can share hope in our culture of confusion. So we're going to look at Acts 17, verses 16 through 34. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Some asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him, and they brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what is this new teaching that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and I looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Now, what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. He does not live in temples built by hands, and he is not served by human hands, as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and maybe reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. I want to suggest there are 5 lessons we can learn from how Paul engaged the Greek world of his day, which was actually also a very confused culture. 5 lessons that we can draw from what Paul did here, and that we can apply as we try and share our hope in Christ with today's culture of confusion. And here's the first one. Lesson number 1 from Acts 17. Take the time to understand. Take the time to understand. You know, it's interesting to look at what Paul did in Athens. If we think back to the start of that passage we just read, did you notice he began by going on a little tourist trip? He walked around the city. He looked at the statues and he looked at the idols and the temples. In other words, he took his time to investigate what the Athenians believe. He didn't just stand up and start preaching. He took the time to figure out, okay, what do they believe? What are they into? What are the things that matter to them? And we can do the same that Paul did in our culture today. We can, for example, learn to ask good questions. We talked yesterday about good questions, didn't we? We talked in the previous talk, rather, about good questions. And we can ask good questions. In fact, in my recent book, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God?, which we may talk a bit about in the next talk, I offer in that book 4, what I like to call them worldview questions, that we can ask of our culture, we can ask of our friends, whether they believe other things or different things to us. We can ask the questions like, you can ask the questions, is there a God and what is he like? What are human beings? What's gone wrong with the world? What's the solution? Do you know, if you're meeting somebody of a different faith, or even someone who's an atheist or a skeptic, those are great questions to sort of say, hey, I'm really interested in what other people believe and some of the big questions of life. I wonder, may I ask you a few questions? And you can use these. Just to give you an illustration of how this works, let me very briefly show you how this might work with Muslims. If you ask your Muslim friend, is there a God and what is he like? And as you talk that through, you will probably eventually discover that the Muslims do indeed believe in one God. His name is Allah. He is utterly one. He's transcendent. And actually, depending on the type of Muslim you're talking to, you may come across the idea as well that that God is unknowable and he's not relational. You don't have a relationship with God in Islam, or not certainly for mainstream Orthodox Islam. The Quran doesn't offer that option. What are human beings? You might say to your Muslim friend. What do you as a Muslim believe about human beings? And depending on how closely your Muslim friend is following the Quran teaches, for example, that humans are slaves of Allah. They were flung out of paradise due to disobedience. In fact, slaves is the big idea in the Quran. If there was a relationship to talk of between human beings and God, it would be one of master and slave. You don't call God your father in Islam. What's gone wrong with the world? That's a great question to ask anybody, whether you're talking to an atheist or to a Muslim. And what's gone wrong with the world? Well, from an Islamic perspective, Allah wants obedience. That's what God demands of humanity, and humans have disobeyed. So all that's gone wrong is broken law. If we just kept God's commands, it would be all right. There is no sort of concept of perhaps covenant or relationship between God and human beings being broken and damaged. No idea of original sin there in the Quran. And what's the solution? Well, interestingly, the Quran says the solution is more commandments. Human beings are forgetful. They forget God's commands, so God sends more commands to us. I often like to say to Muslim friends, have you ever wondered whether the issue might be not so much that we don't know God's commands, but we can't keep God's commandments? Is it not so much a knowledge issue as a power issue? But there we are. But back, of course, to Paul in Acts 17. What's interesting is notice the more he discovered about what the Athenians believed, it moved him to preach Christ. And this is important. I think it's important that we seek to try and engender a spirit of compassion as we talk to those we are ministering to, we want to share Christ with. If it's our atheist friends or our Muslim friends. The more I studied Islam, the more actually I began to feel deeply moved that here is this religious system that traps Muslims, doesn't offer any hope, just weighs you down with law upon law upon law, no hope of salvation, no certainty, no God who offers you his presence or his spirit, no saviour come to rescue you. Just this weighing down of law upon law upon law upon you, and no promise of salvation. That's actually a really hopeless worldview, and it can be really helpful as we understand those around us, that we pray that the Lord would not just give us an insight into what they believe so we can communicate with them, but also we would generate compassion. So that brings me to our next discussion question. So, as before, I'm going to take a couple of minutes. You can turn to the person next to you if you're in the building, or if you're watching at home, perhaps online with friends around you, or if you're on your own, you can just sit and think about this one. But it'd be great if you get a chance to discuss this with somebody. And this is my next discussion question for you. I want you to talk for a couple of minutes about how we can learn to better understand our culture and the beliefs and the values of our friends, our neighbours, etc. How can we ensure that our response is compassion and care, not a kind of sense of superiority? How can we learn to better understand, our friends, our culture, and their beliefs and values? And then how do we ensure that our response is kind of the right one? Think about that for a couple of minutes, and I'll see you in 2 minutes' time. Well, welcome back. We're now going to think about our second lesson we can learn from what Paul does here in Acts 17. We've learnt about taking the time to understand. Second thing Paul does is he goes where the people are. In Acts 17, verse 17, we see then Paul goes. He goes off to the Areopagus. He doesn't wait for them to come to him. Doesn't sit there on a street corner with a sign saying, "Hey, talk to me about Jesus." He figures out, okay, where are people gathering? And in the Athens of the time, the Areopagus is where the thinkers, the debaters, the people who like to talk about ideas would go and talk. This is back in the days before social media. They didn't have Twitter. They had the Areopagus. Although that implies that Twitter is full of intellectual types debating philosophy. Probably not the case, but you get the idea. Paul figured out where's the marketplace, where are people, let's go there. And why that's important is sometimes in the church we do get this wrong. We have a habit of waiting for people to come to us. Maybe we put on perhaps the occasional, outreach service, or we launch a course like Alpha or Christianity Explored or something where they can discover, about Christianity, and we perhaps put an advert in the local newspaper, or we do all kinds of things, but the idea is we're waiting for people to come to us. Paul reverses that entirely, and he goes where people are. Maybe we need to be thinking proactively, how do we engage those who are different to us? Now, one way we also can be tempted to do this as Christians, if you are a student or you're on the workplace, that can be a nerve-wracking place to be a Christian. So sometimes the way that we can sort of drift into this wait for people to come to us is we think to ourselves, hey, if I'm a really nice person, if I just, really kind to my colleagues, very generous to my fellow students, maybe they'll turn around one day and say, hey, what's this Christianity thing you're into? Because I'm a nice person. Well, I really hate to burst your bubble if that's the way you're thinking. Probably in today's post-Christian society, they're not going to do that. What they're going to think is, John or Jane or whoever, they're a really nice person. They're not going to think you're a nice person because you're a Christian. They're simply going to think you're a nice person. And two bad things, of course, follow from that. The first is that your friend isn't connected to Jesus, but even worse, it just draws the attention to you. Which is the last thing we want to be doing as Christians. We want the attention to be drawn to Jesus. So one thing I think is hugely important is go where people are. So what, in your context, that may look different. If you are in the workplace, make sure you spend your time hanging out with non-Christian friends. Don't just go for lunch with the other Christians in the workplace. Go for lunch with the non-Christians. In your neighbourhood, invite families and friends and others in your neighbourhood to lunch. Build friendships, not just with the Christians, with non-Christians. If you want to reach Muslims, by the way, this is a great opportunity. If you've got Muslim colleagues, what an amazing opportunity to find a point of connect, to find a chance to speak with them, and get to know them slightly, and then take the opportunity to say, hey, forgive me for asking, but you're a Muslim. I'm a Christian. I don't know much about what Muslims believe. Could we go for lunch sometime? I would love to hear more about what you believe. And you've made a connection. And once you've asked about what they believe, what a great opportunity to talk about what you believe. If you're a student, a really exciting way to start evangelism to Muslims on your campus, why don't you go, as well as going to your Christian campus ministry, why don't you go occasionally with a friend, because then, it's a courage in pairs, go with a Christian friend and go to the Muslim meeting on campus. Sit at the back, don't take part, you're not pretending to be a Muslim, you're just going as a visitor. Trust me, the Muslims will come to you and ask who you are. You can say, I'm a Christian. I just wanted to come along and see what you folks do. Trust me, a friendship is very likely to begin. In fact, I had some friends in Canada who did this. They began outreaching to their Muslims friends on campus this way. They began going along to their meetings. A friendship formed. That led to coffee together and meals. And out of that began this amazing series of dialogue events where they would get a Christian speaker and a Muslim speaker. They would take a topic, something like, perhaps, sin and forgiveness. The Muslim speaker would speak, the Christian speaker would speak. The audience would be mixed, Muslims and Christians, then Q&A. And they saw many Muslims. They saw Muslims come to faith through those events. But it all began when Christians went, I wonder what would happen if I actually went to where the Muslims are rather than wait for them to come to us. And interestingly, we did the same thing at SOLAS, the organisation I lead here. In the UK, we work with churches to help them put on events in places like cafes, coffee shops, restaurants, bars, secular venues where we put an event on. We do a talk. We have Q&A. We offer food and a drink, and then Christians find it very easy to invite their non-Christian friends. Much easier to say to your non-Christian friend, "Hey, do you want to come down to Starbucks? We got a little talk this evening, and there's coffee and cake." Much easier for our non-Christian friends to do that and come into the church. So let's go where people are. Let's go where people are. Thirdly, take the time to understand. Go where people are. Thirdly, find the points of contact. It's remarkable what we see if you think about it in Acts 17. Paul is a Jew. He's a Jew. He was a Pharisee. He was a Jew of Jews. He talks about that elsewhere in the New Testament, how proud he was of his Jewish heritage before he found Christ. So, as a Jew, he would have been very strongly trained from a young age to react against idolatry. The Old Testament is full of very strong passages there that talk about this foolishness of idolatry. So, as you read Acts 17, you might have expected Paul, as a good Jew, to see all these temples and idols and statues, and you might very well have expected Paul to come along and go, "This is ridiculous, you crazy Athenians, this is all nonsense." But he doesn't. He doesn't lambast and attack the Athenians for their spiritual foolishness, but he finds a place he can bridge from. Look back into Acts 17, 23 and 24. He lands on this idea of the unknown God. And actually, statues, altars to the unknown God have been found by archaeologists in Greece, in ancient in Athens. So we know these from archaeology. These things existed. And Paul just decides, what a beautiful bridge to say, you know what? You're right, there is a God that you guys haven't discovered. But by the way, he's not some minor God. He is the God who made the entire show. He's the God who created absolutely everything. And let me tell you about this unknown God. And Paul starts from there, and then of course as you read through, he quotes their own poets and writers. Rather than quote the Old Testament, these guys don't know the Old Testament. They're not Jewish, they're pagan. So Paul goes, okay, well, let's talk about the things that they know and they're familiar with. So many lessons for us today. How can we do this today? How can we do this today? Well, one of the first things, of course, I think we can do is we can look for examples in the movies, in the movies and stories and stuff that's going on in culture. How can we build bridges from there? Give you a good example. I actually wrote a piece for our local newspaper. We have the opportunity to write occasional columns for one of the newspapers here in Scotland. We've built that link with them, and of course the new Bond movie is making waves, right? Big news. Bond 25, biggest blockbuster since COVID. And of course, what's the new Bond movie called? No Time to Die. So I remember when I first saw that advertised and went and watched the movie, I thought, oh my word, if I can't do an evangelistic link at a No Time to Die, and I wrote this piece, and I've now had conversations with people who use off the same theme as saying, what an interesting movie title. Hey, is there ever a good time to die? Because of course, as an atheist, there never is. Death is the thing you want to avoid at all costs. As a Christian, we don't need to be afraid of death, because death is not the end. And if you can learn to listen to, what are the movies that people are talking about? What are the things we're watching on TV? Are there connections? Doesn't mean you approve and affirm everything. You just find that talking point and that starting point. In the previous talk, I also talked about Charles Taylor, and the Canadian philosopher who wrote a book looking at how we can, the whole question of how we talk about faith in a very secular culture. And, Charles introduces this idea of ghosts of transcendence. Our friends are concerned about things like joy, hope, beauty, meaning, truth, love, free will, ethics, justice. Those are good bridging points. If you're watching TV or the news with a friend or a colleague who's not a Christian, and there's some terrible act of injustice described there on the news, and your friend goes, that's terrible, that's so sad. What opportunity to say, that's really interesting. Why do you think injustice is important? Why do you think it's so crucial that we seek to do justice? There's a conversation starter. Bridge off their passion, their interest for justice, and find ways to bridge that to the gospel. Always be looking for ways that you can do this. One way I often do this, actually, I've often had opportunities to talk about the topic of human rights, and sometimes I get to go and talk in high schools, and I'll often use this as a topic if I'm talking to perhaps in a high school setting where I've been invited in because I'm a local philosopher, so it kind of opens doors, but I'm limited in how Christian I can be because the local high school. I'll often use human rights as the example, and I love nothing more than getting a class of 15, 16-year-olds. We'll explore some contemporary topic. We've used Black Lives Matter, we've used We've used, sort of political prisoners in parts of the world. Any story that gets people thinking about human rights, and we've talked about it, and got the kids thinking about human rights and so forth. And then in the discussion, I'll always throw in the question, okay, so why is human rights true? And that's always an interesting one, because that gets a real reaction. What do you mean? Some kid will often ask, and I'll say, well, okay, we've talked this today about rights and dignity. Well, why do we have rights and dignity? Where are they located? I mean, obviously we can't do an operation and cut somebody open and go, oh look, here's human rights. It's just here under my second rib or whatever. Well, no. So where is it found? And then I like to push people to go further and go, well, look, have you ever thought that actually what you believe about the bigger questions of life, like God and faith and spirituality, actually directly connects to this? Because if you're an atheist, for example, and we're just atoms and particles, human rights doesn't really make any sense, actually. We arrange a group of atoms to make a chair. It doesn't have rights. We take the same group of atoms and throw in a few more and rearrange them to make a human being, and they do have rights. Seems a bit weird. What's going on? On the other hand, if you do have a faith in God, I'm a Christian, I would say, it gives you a really good basis for human rights, actually. That's been a really interesting way I found to bridge the gospel conversations. So, our third discussion question for you today. What might be some other contact points, or, to use the long phrase we've been playing around with, ghosts of transcendence? What might be some of the ways that you might find contact points in the lives of your friends and your neighbours? I've given you a few examples. What might be others, and how might you use those contact points to kind of bridge to the gospel? So as before, take 2 minutes, talk to the person next to you, if there is one, or sit there and think awesome thoughts on your own, if you're watching this on your own. But anyway, think about that for 2 minutes, and then I will see you for the next section in a few minutes. Well, welcome back. We're now on to our fourth lesson from Acts 17. We've taken the time to understand. We go where people are, and we find the points of contact, and then we come to this third one. And the third one is to critique the objects of worship. Critique the objects of worship. I'm going to start that again. Well, welcome back. So we're going to look at our fourth lesson now from Acts 17. We've seen how we take the time to understand, go where people are, find the points of contact, and then fourthly, critique the objects of worship. What do I mean here? Well, look, Paul is very willing to build bridges, from what the Athenians believe, but he is also not afraid to critique the beliefs of the Athenians. He doesn't feel he just needs to say nice things. He critiques them. And the same is true today as we come across these perhaps false gods, in our culture, things that are central to the lives of other people, we can't just offer an alternative. We actually need to critique what people currently believe. Now, it's easy to assume a false god means another religion, right? With our Muslim friends have their set of beliefs. We're going to think in the third lecture a bit about how we engage with some of those. And for sure, you can talk about what your Muslim friends or your Buddhist friends or your Hindu friends believe. And as you gain the confidence, you can say, well, actually, I'm actually not sure that's true. But I want to use the term false god a little bit wider. In fact, Tim Keller, very well-known American pastor in New York, has written a book actually called Counterfeit Gods. And in that book, Keller says a false or counterfeit god is anything so central and essential to your life that should you lose it, your life would feel hardly worth living. And when you think about that definition, actually, there are all kinds of things that can function as false gods. In fact, why don't we do another quick discussion? Turn to the person next to you and for a couple of minutes think about what are some of the false gods currently found in our culture? What are some of the things that people in our culture build their lives upon and make central? For example, give you just one. Career can be an interesting one. You can make your career, your job, the thing that you live for. It is everything to you. That can become a false god. What are some other things? Think about this for 2 minutes. Talk to the person next to you, if you have one, and then I'll see you back as we unpack this a bit more. Well, I hope you found that interesting, and I don't know what you came up with. Let me offer you some more examples. I mentioned career, and maybe you came up with some other ideas, but here are some I think are all over the place, some quite big false gods actually. Individualism is a big one. Individualism says, I am the centre of everything. Boy, social media has encouraged this in our culture, to make ourselves the centre of the entire story. What about me? I want the attention on me. Look at me, like my comments on social media, so on and so forth. Consumerism, that's the belief that I am what I own. You could argue that is the engine that drives so much of the Western world. You know, you need to buy the right things, have the right stuff, and everything will be okay. Closely related, another false god, hedonism. That's the belief that what really matters in life is happiness. It's my happiness that comes first in everything, and that false god is rife. Nationalism, oh, there's a nice, totally non-controversial one. The belief that my nation is the best nation, and that can become a god for many people. You know, everything is seen through the lens of what does it say, about making my culture great or the centre of everything. We live in an age in which relativism, actually, for many people, has become a false god. That's the idea that choice is what matters. Choice, choice, choice. I must have choice, and no one choice, of course, is any better than the other. Tribalism, big one in the internet age, social media age. My group, right or wrong. You could argue that is one of the huge issues dividing our society right now, that we've divided into tribes, are gathered around politics or some other form of identity, and then, we beat up on everybody else. And Christians are not immune from this. Tribalism can be big in Christianity. My denomination, not those, not those heretics down the road. And then, for my atheist friends, perhaps naturalism, the belief that all that matters is matter. That can become an idol, actually. I know many atheists for whom, that is the controlling belief that everything else is centered around. And, when we come across people who as you begin to discern, I think that the idol for this person, the thing they are living for is, then we can begin to question whether those things really satisfy. I often like to, there's a talk I get asked to do a lot in evangelistic settings where I look at our tendency to try and find happiness in these things, and I always showing people they let you down. If you're trying to, if you're trying to find your happiness through your career, what happens when you lose your job, or a new person joins your team at work and that new colleague is cleverer and better than you, and they become the boss's favourite? For your student, and your identity is on your grades, what happens when suddenly you fail an exam and that thing that's defined you is there no longer? We can challenge these false gods and say they don't ultimately satisfy. There's nothing wrong with them in and of themselves. That's always important to say to people. Nothing inherently wrong with loving your country, or with loving your job, or with loving doing well at school. Those are all fine. But if you make that thing the main thing, problems happen. Critique it, just like Paul did. And then fifthly, after you've taken the time to understand, gone where people are, find the points of contact, critique the objects of worship, then I think our last way we take hope to our confused culture is get the conversation naturally to Jesus as soon as you can. Now, Paul in Acts 17, of course, does that with the resurrection. He introduces the idea that, God is much bigger than an idol, much bigger than that. He is the God who created the whole universe. But then, of course, he brings it down to then he stepped into history in the person of Jesus, and Jesus' identity there proved by him being raised from the dead. We don't just want to faff around having conversations about human rights or justice or culture or whatever. We want to start there. Remember, a bridge has to begin somewhere and go to somewhere. We bridge from the culture, the person we're talking to, and their worldview, but then we actually want to build that bridge over to Jesus and clear away the confusion and distraction so they can see Jesus clearly. One way, by the way, to do this, I shared in the earlier talk about questions. And questions are really powerful. Once you've had a conversation is going, one way you can bridge to Jesus quite naturally is be unafraid. If we genuinely think that Jesus is the answer to life, the universe, and everything, don't be afraid of bringing him in at some point to the conversation. And you can do that through one of the ways I'm on this slide here. You can say, this conversation is really interesting. It reminds me of something Jesus said, and introduce Jesus that way. If the conversation is around something where Jesus said something, you could say that reminds me of something Jesus did. That reminds me of a story that Jesus told. For example, I might be talking to someone about spirituality and faith, and I got the conversation there, and perhaps the person I'm talking to might say, I struggle with the idea that you Christians believe that Jesus is exclusively the true. I mean, I much prefer the idea that everyone is on their journey towards God. I often meet folks who believe in that kind of that's the idol of relativism. And I can say a few things there, but ultimately I want to find an opportunity to go, this is a really interesting conversation. And it reminds me of something Jesus said. Because on one occasion, Jesus actually said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What an incredible thing to say. What do you think? And, it's interesting for the person to realise that Jesus is the source of this. And, of course, as they struggle with that, that gives me an opportunity to say, of course, the big question is not whether Jesus said that. Surely, though, of course, the big question is whether it's true. If he said it and it isn't true, it's just arrogant. But if it is true, then even if I might struggle with it, I need to respond, don't I? I wonder how I know if it might be true. That reminds me of something that Jesus did. And then I can talk about the resurrection. This works very well with Muslims too, by the way. Remember, for Muslims, for our Muslim friends, Jesus is an important figure in Islam. We're going to talk about that in the third talk. Of course, the Jesus they believe in is not the Jesus of the Bible, but the Quran that tells you very little about Jesus. So with a Muslim, there's so many opportunities to be looking for things in the conversation where you can say, that reminds me of something Jesus said. Then that reminds me of something Jesus did. And then get your Bible out and share the story. You will find more receptivity with Muslims if you do that, and connect it to Jesus. So then, how do we draw all the threads together here? Well, all this brings us back, doesn't it, to where we began at 1 Peter 3, verse 15. Always in your heart set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Whenever I read those words, I think, and I look at Acts 17, I find myself thinking, it wasn't easy for those first Christians to reach their culture. It wasn't easy for Peter as he went across the ancient world preaching. It wasn't easy for Paul to try and reach a culture like Greece, a culture of total confusion, so different from his Jewish roots. But what did he do? What did all the first Christians do? They followed the Spirit's leading, and through Paul, through Peter, through Damaris, through Dionysius, through all these figures that we read about in the pages of the New Testament, a gospel seed was planted that grew and grew. And it can be equally tough today for us to think about stepping outside of our comfort zones into the culture of confusion in which we live. But just think what God might do through us if we do. A friend of mine recently plucked up the courage to invite a Muslim colleague at work and his wife to dinner. And the colleague accepted. He and his wife came to my friend's house for dinner. They had a lovely kind of time together. And the conversation quickly actually turned to Jesus. With Muslims, it isn't hard. And it wasn't long before, they were having conversation about faith over the dinner table. But then my friend was very struck by something his Muslim colleague said. At the end of their time together, his Muslim colleague said, "Thank you so much for inviting us. My wife and I have so enjoyed getting to know you and talking about these things that really matter." He said, "You know what?" He said, "It's just so refreshing because I have lived in this country for 20 years, and tonight was the first time I've ever been inside a Christian home." My colleague was kind of blown away by that. My friend was blown away by that, and felt quite guilty actually. He hadn't invited his colleague earlier. For 20 years, this Muslim had lived in the UK, had been very open to talking about things of faith, but no Christian had ever actually reached out and invited him. My friend did, and thus began a friendship and a conversation that is still going on. I wish I could say that Muslim is now a Christian, but that conversation is still going on, and Jesus is at the heart of it. My friends, how might God use us if we step up and step out? Well, rather than pray for you, which I've done in the previous talk and I'm going to do in the next talk, I think it'd be great to pray together. So what I'm going to do, let's end in that, with a time together praying. Why don't you turn to the person next to you or two or three around you? If you're on your own at home, you can still pray. But if you've got people with you, why not pray together? And pray that God would give you a fresh heart for evangelism, a fresh love for your culture, for those around you, be they secular or Muslim, whoever they are around you. Pray that God would give you boldness, and pray that he would give you opportunities to share Christ and give that reason for the hope that you have. Anyway, I shall leave you to pray as we bring this talk to a close. Thanks for listening.